Hello, thank you very much, David. Can you hear me okay, just as a quick check?
Yeah, I think the audio just went down, but it seems to be back up now.
Okay, great stuff. Yeah, always teething problems with these IT elements. So thank you very much for inviting us to do a quick presentation to the Scottish Change Management Network webinar. My name's Stephen Revill. I'm co-founder of a company called Urban Tide, and we deliver open data services to the government and the public sector in Scotland and across the UK. So I'm going to do a kind of a 25-minute presentation on open data and how it drives social change. So there we go. The screen's slowly loading, and obviously this is about open data. So we've just finished running a series of workshops across the public sector for the Scottish Government, 27 workshops in the last year to train and to capacity build knowledge and skills for open data. And every one of these workshops we've started with this slide because open data is quite a clear concept actually in terms of what it is and what it says people need to do. Very simply, open data is data and content that can be freely used, modified and shared by anyone for any purpose. So sometimes this is a difficult concept to get people's head around. Effectively it means that once you publish your data on the internet with an open license, people can do with it whatever they want. And that is a really important line to draw in the sand when we're talking about open data. So to give a very quick context of open data, the G8 countries, so the UK and the other countries, signed an open data charter in June 2013, which was around 5 key principles of open data. So all public sector organisations should be doing Principle 1, open data by default. All processes, governance, etc. should be managed in a way that ensures that is the default position. You're publishing your data as a public asset. The second is you've got to try and improve the quality and the quantity of data that you publish. It's accepted that it's not possible to publish all data as open data on day one, and that data can be published more and more. Then the third is looking at the data to be usable by all, and we'll talk briefly about what that means, but it has to come in a number of different formats effectively so that different people can use it. So that's the normal user that wants to see some visualizations to the developer community that want to be able to take the data and reuse it. Then got Principle 4, which is releasing data for improved governance. So that is issues to do with improved transparency and accountability of government, effectively publishing the data that you make your decisions based on improves accountability, and we've got some great examples from across the globe of that in this presentation. And then finally releasing data for innovation, and that really is something that says that the data that's held in these organisations is an asset, but what else can be done with it? Can the data be linked together from different areas, different silos of data? Can new intelligence be gathered or new services created? So that's the very core basis of open data. In Scotland, we've got some other pieces of legislation which I won't go into too much detail on these today, but they're all important in this space. And for example, we never say publish data that contravenes the Data Protection Act. It's a very important piece of legislation which we don't want to contravene at all. So no personal data is published under open data. And then the other point to note is that in March this year, the Scottish Information Commissioner made open data a new class of data within the Model Publication Scheme. So the Model Publication Scheme is something that all public sector bodies at least have to adhere to and say what they're doing about certain elements of what they manage. And open data being a class of that means that you now have to indicate what data you're making available as open data and when you're going to make that data available and where as well. So have a look at those if you're interested, and I can obviously provide some more background on it if you are interested in the Q&A. So the Scottish Government set out a vision in 2020 for 2020 that recognises the value of data as an asset and a public asset, and you've got to make use of this data to improve public services. So I won't dwell on the background here. And again, in the Scottish Government strategy published February 2015, it talks about the same kind of themes that we've already talked about in the G8 principles for open data. And you can see them there as well. Just finally on the strategy piece, the targets that the Scottish Government set out is that all public sector organisations should have an open data publication plan in place by December 2015. So that's nearly a year ago now, and that is effectively to say what data you plan to publish and when. It's as simple as that. And to publish data in a minimum of a 3-star format by 2017. So the 3-star format, just to add on to that, is based on this scale. So very quickly, the idea of this scale is that as you go up the scale, the data becomes more reusable by people that want to reuse it. So a 1-star is a PDF or a map image that makes the data available, but it's very difficult for people to reuse it. The next step is an Excel spreadsheet or Word document or other type of proprietary software publication that means the majority of people can reuse it, but not everybody can. And that's why CSV or open Word documents or whatever become the 3rd step and the 3rd star in terms of open data. We're not going to talk about 4 and 5-star today. Quite involved in technical development that basically puts the data in the internet rather than being files on the internet. And then very quickly, to publish open data, you need to publish the data under an open data license. And there's a couple of key options here. The main one used in the UK by public sector and by private sector publishing bodies or universities is the Open Government License, which is now version 3. And this does 2 key things. It allows people the opportunity to use the data, free of charge, do whatever they want with it, exploit the information commercially and non-commercially, for example. But it also protects the organisation publishing the data. So there's elements around it that make sure that there's no bite back, basically, if, for example, the data is wrong or incorrect, or if the data ceases to be there in a year's time and people have built services or applications off it. There's no bite back for the organisation that publishes it, so it kind of helps both the publishing organisation and the reuser of the data. So to move on to the main element of today's discussion, that's the impact of open data. So very difficult to actually look at quantifying or qualifying social impact of open data. So basically the best bodies in this field, including the ODI, the Open Data Institute, I've kind of, I suppose, struggled with really quantifying it. There's a lot of qualitative examples, and a lot of qualitative examples we'll share today, and also some quantitative examples. But what the ODI have done is basically separate the impact of open data into 4 different areas, effectively. So you can see them here: improving government, empowering citizens, solving public problems, and creating opportunities with the data. So they're the 4 key areas that the ODI have broken potential social impact, positive social impact of open data into. And I've got some examples basically to back that up. There has been quite a lot of work done previously on looking at the economic impact of open data. So even just looking at the economic impact can be said to be some sort of a social impact. A number of reports published by groups such as McKinsey and others that have done some research in the area, an estimated global market powered by open data from all sectors would create an additional 3 trillion to 5 trillion a year on the sort of GDP of the world. I think that's an increase of about 4% on the GDP of the world if all public sector data that could be open data was made open data. You've then got the European Data Portal providing some insight and saying that, you know, by 2020 costs around open data, open data can help reduce costs, for public administrations by 1.7 billion a year, and also the market size of open data increasing to 76 billion in 2020. So very interesting examples. UK companies, from the Open Data Institute, this one is UK companies producing or investing in open data has combined annual turnover of over 92 billion, employing over 500,000 people. So basically what they're saying is that open data is generating a private sector market as well, creating jobs. TfL, Transport for London, a fantastic example which we'll talk about because it is social impact and it's many different types of impact. But they've estimated the return on their investment in doing the open data is 58-1, which is pretty incredible. And some other examples there to kind of note and look at too. So just quickly to kind of highlight why there is I suppose a lack of social examples, social impact examples and quantification of them, is that there's still an element of novelty of the field of open data, which, although it's been around for a number of years, I think the sort of groundswell and opinion is that it's still very much an untapped opportunity, and as it becomes more of a tapped opportunity, then these type of things will happen. So the novelty of the field feeds into it. And there's also, I suppose, inherent difficulties in measuring good governance and social change and attributing it just to the release of data, for example. It could be any number of factors that improve an area or whatever. So the potential benefit categories that we could look to kind of quantify is around the education or informing of the citizens so that they can make more informed choices, the promotion of direct civic engagement and increased citizen participation in the democratic process. So interestingly, the Scottish Government has just made a pioneer in open governance, a world pioneer region status, so it'll be interesting to see how that develops. The idea obviously being that the engagement with the citizen is stronger and the citizen gets more what they need. You could also gather feedback from policymakers in the private sector and monitor and hold officials and our private sector accountable. So I want to move now, I guess, properly to the examples and some real great examples in here of driving positive social impact through open data. And they're drawn from across the globe, but you can see, I think, how they can all relate in the UK. So firstly, if we remember that roundel, we're going to look at improving government effectively. So this is a lovely example from Nigeria about understanding government spending effectively. I think criticism was rife at the amount of transparency there was in terms of government spending. And this budge IT or budget or whatever you want to call it is basically making the case of saying that we'll release more data, make it simple and accessible for citizens to use, and raising the citizens' ability to demand accountability from public officers. So effectively in a country that could be seen to be corrupt or have problems with corruption, this is the type of information that can help solve that problem and hold people more accountable. And I'm just looking at some more detailed text here on my computer, but it says over 270,000 citizens in Nigeria have been effectively reached by this initiative. So that's quite a lot of people. Simply. Here's another great example from Nigeria, looking at using data to help Nigerians track social issues, understand again the importance of governance and fight corruption. So this is more technical, I suppose, in the example. This is making the data available online again, but very much making the data available in API formats, so it's much easier for the developer community to use and to integrate the data and to understand effectively what's happening. So this kind of online available service has mapping tools in it, and it allows people to download the data more easily and in a better format for some people. So it's had 40,000 downloads in the last year. Now we're moving across to South America now, looking at an example from Chile, and this is about improving participatory democracy and reducing information asymmetries between the Chilean citizens and their government. And so this was developed actually as far back as 2009 by the Smart Citizen Foundation, and it's looking at promoting transparency and citizen participation through the use of technology. And it was created as an electoral platform to gather data on different candidates and thus increase the chances of informed voting. So it was a way that people could put information in about the potential candidates, information that they knew, to try and, you know, burst the bubble, I guess, on what people were telling or what was in the press or propaganda, to try and give people the informed option when it comes to voting. So some of those examples you'll think, well, they're empowered citizens too, and I think it's completely true, but there's a lot of overlap between these government improving principles and the empowered citizen principles. But to try and break it down and make it more accessible to understand, we wanted to break that down. So now we're moving again, well, it's in South America again, but looking at Uruguay. So this example was about making it easier for citizens in Uruguay to view and compare information about their healthcare providers. And in the first month alone, the site received approximately 35,000 visits, which was equivalent to 1% of the total population. So you can see there's a massive appetite for it, and the people are also using it. So the problem really was that there was a mix of public and private healthcare systems, and several factors came into play with people's decision making, including the location of the healthcare provider, the number of doctors available at that location, the hours of opening, and so making that data available as open data allowed people to understand where best to go for the healthcare that matched their needs. So obviously we can provide a lot more information on these examples, but I think that's a really nice one. We've then got an example which looks completely differently, back more to home and in the UK, and this is a Nesta funded open data project which was completed in 2015. But it basically looked at giving youngsters, or people between the age of 14 to 16, more information to be able to make really important decisions at that stage in their life. So to help explore and compare different options before they decide on which way to go. And so there's lots of information in there that can be used to help that information. And you can basically go and have a look at that, because it's really good to explore through the types of data that are available, and to help consider what options, where you want to go in terms of your job eventually, and what skills are available with different types of grades and all that type of stuff. That having it in one place gives a much better social opportunity and social impact than having to go and do it yourself effectively. So, from creating an opportunity, I mentioned Transport for London as an example earlier. This is probably one of the best and most cited examples of open data across the world, to be honest. So Transport for London, if you didn't know, they basically made the decision they were going to release all of their transport data as open data. So that's everything from their live bus information, live metro, or whatever you call it, underground information. So that's the real location of the subway cars, and real location of buses, and prediction of when these services are going to arrive. Obviously, the timetable information and other pieces of information around how you would travel around London effectively. So they released that as open data. So you can go and have a look at it now. It's open data. If you want to sign up to a feed, you have to put in a couple of pieces of information, and you basically get access to that live feed of data. So there's been 10,000 developers who've done that since they released that, and there's at least 460 applications being used regularly, which reach millions of users. And the latest statistics show that over 50% of people in London use one of these applications. So Transport for London are saving money in not providing a journey planning service, although they still do have a service available, but it's being used less and less, and the private sector service is being used more and more. And obviously Londoners and people that go to London like it, and the city mapper that you can see in the bottom right hand corner of the screen there, the city mapper is the one that's got the most traction, the most users, and it really helps you navigate around London very nicely indeed. So in May this year, TfL looked to quantify the benefit, and they stated that they believe that there's been £160 million worth of travel time saved by people travelling through London every year, or in the last year effectively, by people using the open data apps. So the open data has basically provided this £160 million of savings, and that's where that very large return ratio comes from, because they obviously had the data already, and the only thing that they really had to invest in doing was making that data available. That was the key thing. So that's fantastic. But what I like about the London example as well is they didn't stop there. They went and asked the user of these applications and the people that travel across London if there was anything missing. And basically what transpired was it was great, the apps were available, they were great, but they missed, for certain user groups, people with additional accessibility requirements effectively. So you can see here a couple of the applications that were developed off the back of a challenge fund. So after TfL learnt this, they put a challenge out. They said, give us your ideas, the best ideas, we'll fund them, and go away and sort of create them, and there you go. So you can see one there that gives more information about how to access a station, a subway station or a rail station. And the one on the right hand side, people with, I suppose, different viewing needs in terms of the colour schemes and things like that. So more about creating the opportunity. Now we're going to move slightly across the North Sea to Denmark and look at what they've done. So they've embraced open data quite readily. As the UK has, it's fair to say, UK is still one of the leaders in open data. So it's not that we're really behind the curve, but there's some good examples out there to obviously learn from. And the key one here was Denmark's open data, the open address data set. They decided back in 2005 to start basically opening up the register of buildings and make it free of charge to people and to businesses in Denmark and obviously outside Denmark as well. But the study has estimated that direct financial benefits alone for the period 2005 to 2009 are at around £62 million, 60 million euros, sorry, at a cost of only €2 million. So that's a 30-to-1 return on investment there. And some other interesting facts that you can kind of look at if you look in more detail at this is that 70% of the users of this information were private companies, but 20% came from central government and 10% from municipalities. So there's a benefit there in creating innovation, but also in sharing the data with other public sector partners as well. So another nice example. This is using open data to help different community groups, I suppose, but really this is a great example of crowdsourced community data as well, acting as open data. But the idea here in this food trade element is that the people that want to sell food, sustainable food network growers and people like that, that are effectively up against big businesses, have somewhere they can go to share what they've got available and to therefore sell it. So they become part of a network of organisations, of businesses that want to sell food, effectively, or food services. And so this food map has been created, and it's allowing people to use it to see where they can sell food or where you can buy food, I suppose. And it's just won a national tech innovation competition, so it's got some really good reviews. And then finally moving to the solving public problems element, there's a lot of really good examples around open data being used in critical situations to really benefit society. So we've got this improvements in malaria treatment, which is an example of not just open data, but also kind of open sharing of information and ideas. So effectively it was the open development of malaria drugs, which allowed lots of different organisations to be involved in the open source development of anti-malarial drugs. And as a result, 4 new anti-malarial drugs were developed, and a box of anti-malarial compounds is freely available to anyone wishing to develop new drugs in developing countries. So the kind of crowdsourcing effectively of knowledge and of development allowed this to reach more deeply. And then battling Ebola in Sierra Leone, again, it was effectively a data sharing crisis. That was one of the biggest problems, was a lack of understanding of where the outbreaks were occurring, and so people were crowdsourcing that type of information, and where access to care was as well. So by basically sharing that information, making it available, it was possible to use that to really help tackle the Ebola crisis. And I know it was used by organisations in the UK looking to understand where to send aid to by looking at this type of information. So you can see in times of crisis that open data is very, very useful. And here's another example, again, of open data in times of crisis. This is go back to the Haiti earthquake back in 2010, I think it was. And this is a map, the OpenStreetMap of the capital, Port-au-Prince, before the earthquake occurred. Now, after the earthquake, immediately after the earthquake, there was a company called GOI, or a spatial mapping company, that released aerial photography images with an open license to allow people to map it. And basically, it's a fantastic visualization we can link you to after this, but it shows how quickly the open data community map the region. And within a couple of days, the map of that region, I know it's a slightly more zoomed in map, but it looked like that. So there's a massive difference in the quality of the mapping. And this has been used, this was used by recovery and disaster recovery teams on the ground using Garmin devices and things like that to actually understand where refugee camps were. You can see the refugee camps there with a little kind of red tent on it, where they were and how to access them. And you can also see, like, for example, the hospital ship on the left in the harbour, which allowed people to understand where to go as well. And it keeps on going. There's more examples of open information effectively around healthcare trials. So to make the information open, easy to use, creating a linked database. So that's a really high quality open database that basically allows you to understand the links between different clinical trials across the world. So it might be that the same clinical trial has been taking place in different areas, or very similar clinical trials. So you can go, you can understand not just what's happened, but also the links between what's happened. And it might, for example, lead you not to undertake your own clinical trials because it's already been done in a similar situation elsewhere. And one of the kind of leading to one of the few final examples is a lovely one from Manchester, Trafford area of Manchester, and a third sector organisation put two pieces of open data together. They brought information about where existing defibrillators were in the Trafford region, and also where people were suffering from cardiac arrest, heart attack type conditions. And by using those two pieces of data, they were able to indicate where there was a lack, where there was a gap, effectively. And with having that intelligence, they were able to crowdsource more funding, and they were able to crowdsource funding for 72 defibrillators, which were then deployed on the ground, and they have been used to save lives for real, basically. And there is a picture of a guy, and this is called Staying Alive. So the slightly embarrassing dance can be done if you want, but that's basically some gentleman whose life has been saved because of that defibrillator. So it really crystallises a great example of how open data can have positive social impact. And then just a couple of more kind of, a little bit more out there examples. So I think this is the last one actually. And this is about basically making open physical activity data as a service. And to help with this, people sign up effectively to release their data. And data around their physical activity effectively. So the infrastructure is there, and if your organisation, your company, for example, wants to sign up, they can do that. Or if individuals want to sign up, I think they can do that too. And they put in information about their physical activity. And that's obviously up for anybody to decide to opt in or opt out. But basically, that would be a fantastic resource for practitioners to understand a number of key elements within improving health and how it links with physical activity. So it's asking, I suppose, the community to join it and crowdsource their data, through existing applications. A lot of people collect healthcare data or activity data that could be very useful. And I suppose ideally the idea is that you give your data and that you also get something back in terms of recommendations on how to improve your health or groups that are available for you to go to and things like that. So it provides a very strong civic engagement between, I suppose, the user and the healthcare provider as well. And just to kind of wrap up in terms of the positive benefits, a recent study looked at Open Data Challenge series in the UK, and it said that for each £1 spent, there could be a generation of £5 to £10 in the UK economy in 3 years. So again, you're seeing a really good return on investment there for open data. So really to kind of recap, I guess, it's about making data available because that asset is partially unutilised. It's used for a certain purpose, of course it is, it's collected for a certain purpose, and it's untapping that resource is the main thing that open data does. And there's also some private sector examples of private sector organisations publishing data and making it available, which has helped them as a private sector organisation. There's one that I love from New York. A mobile phone company didn't understand, a mobile phone service provider didn't understand why they were getting a really poor uptake in the Korean community, and they basically released the data sets and were able to understand that it was because the Korean language information they provided was actually wrong, and were able then to improve it and improve that take-up. So there's some really good examples of how the private sector can use the open data community resource to improve their own services and to benefit as well. So just to wrap up, from an Urban Tide point of view, we've delivered those training courses now with 27 events, 317 public sector body organisations sent attendees, and we have now completed that, just finalising the evaluation report, which is very positive, thankful to say. And now Urban Tide have some open data opportunities available on our own website, so you can go there and have a look and sign up if you're interested, or just have a look, obviously. And also in terms of the publication of open data, we now have available effectively an open data software as a service platform, which allows public sector organisations and private sector organisations to put their data on the internet in just a few clicks, and up to 10 data sets is completely free forever, so it can be used basically as a testing environment to see if it works as well. So really, thank you very much for listening. Hopefully I haven't bored too many people with those examples, and there's still some people around for questions and answers. But thanks, David, for the opportunity as well to speak. And like I said just before we started, it was great actually researching some of these examples that you want to learn more about, because there's some really good examples out there of open data and how it drives positive social impact. So thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Some really interesting and diverse examples there. As I was saying just at the start, if you have, we will be sharing the slides and the recording of this session in the follow-up email. If there's any resources or examples which Stephen's pointed out, then could you please list these in the question box, and following the webinar I'll work with Stephen and we will make sure that we get all these out to you as well, so you can have a look around open data. Just going straight into the questions, we've got a few questions coming in. If you've got any more, then please put these in the question box as well. The first one's from my colleague Claire, actually. Some really interesting examples with loads of ideas. Have you been working with any local councils to provide open data?
Yeah. I suppose personally, dating back to when we started the organisation was Glasgow City Council. And more recently we've been doing work with Perth, Kinross and Renfrew Share. And I suppose the piece that we've been doing that's probably most interesting in the last few months with Perth and Kinross is to look at prioritisation of the data sets that they're going to publish. They kind of know what they've got, which is actually a first step that needs to be taken by a lot of organisations. They know what they've got, but it's about releasing the data sets that maybe are most beneficial first, and you can do that in a number of ways. You can look at other examples where data has been used and say, okay, it's been used there, so let's assume it can be used elsewhere. Or you can look at the ease of being able to publish the data sets, and because obviously in some cases it can be quite difficult with data locked in back in systems or political sensitivity of data. So there's a middle ground to be tread there, but I think the most important thing is making sure the data is interesting for people to reuse, and it's not just about publishing something that no one wants to see. And also, I suppose we've done work with all of the Scottish cities through the Scottish Cities Alliance, which was about, and this program's developing on for the next few years, but it's about sort of mandating and making the open data approach across all the 7 cities more common. So they'll be looking at making sure they publish the same data sets so that people can do work in Dundee, they can also do work in Stirling, and also to try and inject more into the community part of it. So for capacity building, skills building, and generating a community of open data that can help each other. So really interesting developments in Scotland, and I think Scotland's actually got the opportunity to really be world leading through that initiative as well. So yeah.
Just a quick follow-up to that one, Stephen, just from David Brown. What real-world examples did Glasgow deliver?
So that's a good question, David. In terms of number of data sets, it was up towards 400 at one point. I think it's dropped down to 360 now. Not being involved any more than that, I don't really know why. A couple of ones that spring to mind that are really useful are they released their live traffic data from their loops in the ground, which is a fantastic asset that not a lot of organisations have made open. And there was another one to do with stalled spaces, effectively releasing the data and information about stalled spaces helped some organisations basically push for PVs, like solar panels, to be installed in the stalled spaces. And so now there basically are solar panels in stalled spaces generating electricity that wouldn't, you could argue wouldn't be there before without releasing the open data. But there are two that spring to mind.
Thank you, Stephen. Next question is from Gerard McCormack. What opportunities do you see for open data enhancing community empowerment across Scotland to enable communities to better participate?
Yeah, Gerard, I think there's a lot. I think it also needs to be tied in with the Open Government Pilot Pioneer programme from the Scottish Government, and I think that's key. I think releasing data is the most important thing, is open data. I was at a supplier engagement day in Bristol earlier this year, and they'd done some work on analysing what people use the data for, and the most common use of the data by the people that use the open data was for community benefits. So the open data communities there the drive to benefit the community is absolutely there. So I think the opportunity is obviously there, but I think what needs to be done is that more organisations need to publish more data, and it's data that they already have, so it shouldn't be that difficult. And then to build on that kind of civic engagement piece is probably the trickiest and the most advantageous element, is to make sure there is an engagement around the data so that people get what they need, they get what they want, and they can also bring ideas to the table as well. Yeah, so I think there is opportunity there, and there's a couple of important players, including the Scottish Government, that could really help in that regard.
Thanks, Stephen. Next question is Gary Todd. Are there any funding opportunities for open data solutions for local government? He has a national solution and concept, but are struggling to find organisations that could understand the reality of impact this could have.
Right, okay, sorry, could you just re-ask the question, David? Sorry, I'm just...
Sorry, are there any funding opportunities for open data solutions for local government?
Yeah, I guess not overly directly. The Scottish Government have obviously finished a training pilot, which was in some way helpful, and there's funds in Europe. We'll leave that element of it aside, but there are funds in Europe that look at open data and that kind of thing. But it doesn't seem to be that there's too many massive funds available for open data out there. The Nesta Challenge series that did a bit of work over the last couple of years in Scotland that we didn't talk too much about there, they were offering that kind of thing. But I would say that's more of a gap in the market, to be honest, than being massive. Lots of money out there, unfortunately, to go and untap that. There's some open source communities out there and open networks that would really help in terms of intelligence and bring people up to speed. But in terms of actual funding, I think there's a gap there, unfortunately. Yeah.
Thanks, Stephen. Next question is from Andy Maguire. What are the key things that public sector leaders need to do to fulfil the potentials of open data?
So I think, Andy, from my opinion, the key thing that they need to do is to be leaders and to offer clear strategic intent. There is the Scottish Government, there's the G8 documentation all out there saying this should be done. There's also legislation through the reuse of public sector information regulations that is there. And from the training that we did over the last year, it was clear that the majority of the people that came were not in the really high leadership positions that would drive this type of undying devotion, I suppose, to open data. And I think the real key thing is that these people need to be bought into the process and articulate that. An open data strategy is very easy to create, and also, to be honest, I think an open data publication plan is quite easy to create, to get these documents in place so there's a reference point, and to do a little bit of visioning to understand what the potential benefits could be as well, to give some sort of a light at the end of the tunnel and all the work that we need to go on to get the data open are the key things for me. But really being leaders and offering strategic intent is the most pressing. And I pull an example, say, from Renfrewshire, who very quickly created a fantastic open data strategy, and if you search Renfrewshire open data strategy, you can see it, and that was great. But unfortunately, for resources that they ended up, so I'm not parking it as such, but key people got onto other areas, and this is the kind of thing that I don't think can necessarily happen. I think it's really great that Renfrewshire are pushing for that, and I think that they can get a lot of benefit from it. So I think they've done the key bit in you know, being strategically intentful and getting leadership up there. It's obviously necessary to make sure that that kind of thing continues.
Thanks, Stephen. Next question is from Cammy Mackay. Sorry. How is the return on investment measured?
Right. Okay. So I suppose that's one of the issues here. Is that it's difficult to properly measure the return on investment across the board. But the way Transport for London did it was obviously that, you know, looking at the 160 million savings of travel time and comparing it to how much they spent on it. And through the other examples, you can see the Danish example of how much money it cost to release certain types of data and how much benefit they believe has happened to the GDP because of it. So you're getting the economic argument again there. And I suppose, not that it's done very often, but if you looked at examples of the Ebola case study whereby you could maybe indicate how many lives have been saved or that type of thing, then very quickly you could identify the benefit in terms of the cost, because we know that we can attribute cost positives to people's lives being saved. So I think that's an area for open data to look at more, because in some cases it's difficult to definitely attribute the open data benefit to the benefit. But it's worked up in a number of ways, I suppose, is the best way to say it at the moment. There's no key core standard around that.
Thanks, Stephen. Next question is from my colleague Claire again. Public sector agencies to have open data strategies in place by 2015. How far along are organisations to having these in place?
Okay, Claire, so I think you're just asking for a kind of a general, in terms of Scottish organisations. Over the last year, more and more have started putting them in place. I think that there's probably around sort of a quarter to a third maybe now of public sector organisations in Scotland with them in place. I think probably the NHS cover themselves quite well through, you know, the ISD and their joint sort of board, which means that you could arguably cover a lot more of the NHS organisations, but you know, they've got that central piece, but actually the regional areas don't seem to have those in place. From local government perspective, there's a lot of examples out there that are in place, and then other public bodies. There's some key ones, I think, that work with data, and data is their day-to-day job almost, like national libraries, Scotland, for example, that have one in place, and then others that maybe they use data, but it's not maybe their day job, or maybe a little bit further behind. But I'd say about a quarter of public sector organisations, and if, depending on how you count it, I think there's about 150, 151 or whatever. I think at least a quarter of them now have one in place.
Thanks, Stephen. And back to David Brown. In the Trafford example, how did they release the personal data on who had heart attacks in what area?
Yeah, so they didn't release the personal data, so they basically looked at aggregating the type of heart attack information up to a number that was permissible, I suppose. And you know, the NHS do this a lot with a figure that should be not less than 5. So by doing that, you can get an understanding of the sort of gaps and issues. And if a number, for example, is lower than 5, then you could assume that maybe that's an area that doesn't need it. But basically, it's about making sure you release the data in a way that doesn't worry anyone's personal information. And so that's how that kind of open data set was set up. And what the NHS do in this example as well is you basically aggregate up until you get to a number that is, you know, 5 or higher. So that was that, David.
Thank you, Stephen. That seems to be all the questions for just now. Just as I mentioned at the start of the webinar, this is a recorded session and we will be sharing the slides, recording and other resources. The easiest way to access these is to join the Change Managers Network group on Knowledge Hub. This is also the group which which underpins this webinar series. Following the close of this webinar, there will be a short survey. We're constantly looking to find out how we can improve the series, find out what kind of speakers you'd like to hear, and also get feedback for our speakers going forward. So if you could please take the time to fill that out, then that would be greatly appreciated. Our next webinar will be at the end of next month. It will be hosted by Rich Knight on systems thinking within the Environment Agency. So I will also include a link to join that webinar in the follow-up email that will go out following this session. I'd like to thank Stephen for giving up his time to present today. It was very interesting for me, and I hope that you all enjoyed the session as well. So thank you very much for attending, and I hope to see you sometime soon. Thank you.